The last time we took our pontoon boat, Fin and Tonic, out, we noticed that there was some sluggish acceleration. I thought initially maybe I had a clogged fuel filter, but then I started to think it was the dreaded clogged VST filter. The VST, or Vapor Separator Tank, is basically the last line of defense to get dirt or water or debris out of the fuel before it goes into the fuel injector rails. When we got the engine, we knew that it was due for the 100-hour service, and when I hooked up the software, diagnostic software to the engine, it said there were 932 hours on the engine. So I'm guessing that the VST had probably never been cleaned or replaced. I disconnected the old fuel filter and took a look at it and poured the gas out, and everything there looked good. Plus, you can see it has a new filter element in it. Also, just to the right of that, the round thing with the braided hose coming off of it is a low-pressure fuel pump, which was recently replaced. So it led me to believe that the problem was going to be a little deeper inside of the engine. I put the fuel filter bowl back on, and then I started to take apart the different parts of the engine so I could access the VST. The first thing that has to come off is the flywheel cover, which is just held on with 2 bolts, and that was pretty easy. And then this other plastic thing is actually called the intake silencer. I was able to find several videos online about how to service the VST, but they didn't really go into depth about how difficult it is to get to. One of them actually was pretty detailed, and he suggested taking lots of pictures as you're doing it. But I'm documenting it with video here too, so I'll just try to remember how it all goes back together. There are a series of bolts that are 10 and 12 millimeter. I believe there are 9 of them that kind of hold everything together. So once you get the intake silencer off, the next thing you have to do is to remove the gold part, which is the intake manifold. There are a bunch of hoses that kind of are pushed on, which you just have to remember where everything goes. You can mark it, and in my case, actually, as I started taking the VST apart and getting it separated from the rear of the intake, the hoses were kind of fused to the tank, so I actually had to cut them and order new ones. And if you can avoid doing that, do that, because they're very expensive for some reason. I went to an online Yamaha place, I think it was Yamaha Online Parts, and ordered the 2 hoses, and they were like $300. And they're basically just fuel lines, but one of them has a 90-degree bend that's formed in it. So you just take all these bolts out and set them aside and kind of remember where they go. You could even write it down. And then these 2 brackets, this upper and lower bracket, also have 2 bolts that hold it onto the block, and then there are 2 bolts that hold the intake onto the bracket, and I just removed everything. It was easier to get to that way. When you get to this bolt, this kind of holds on a mechanism that is part of the throttle, and there's a spring behind it, so just take note of that, because otherwise it will fall down and you'll wonder where the spring came from. Once all the bolts are removed, the intake manifold is free to be removed. It just is held in place with a bunch of a wrench in this case, and then also fuel lines that push on, and there's some clamps and a couple of zip ties that have to be cut in order to kind of wiggle it out of there. It's really shoehorned in pretty good. There are also 2 connections. I don't really know what that one is. That goes to the fuel injectors. And then there's another connection which is on top of the VST tank, and that is if you have a water and fuel alarm. It'll set that off because there's a float inside of the tank that's connected to that white plug. You can see here there's some little pinch clamps that go on to the tank that hold some of the hoses in place. In this case, the hose was kind of melted to the bottom of the tank, and I tried to wiggle it off and use some solvent and everything else, and I couldn't. So I ended up cutting it there and ordered a new hose. Both of these hoses were actually very difficult to get off the top of the tank. Here you can see the tank is somewhat loose. Sometimes people will work on it from here, but I thought it was easier to just remove the entire tank, because there are, I think, 7 screws on top of it that are Phillips head, that in this case, one of them I almost could not get out. And I've seen in the different forums, people will put new screws in there with like a Torx head or a hex head to prevent them from getting, I guess, stripped because then you have to buy a new tank, and a new tank is like $600. I will spare you the agony of getting the hoses off, and you can see I had to cut some of them. And this is what the tank looks like. Now remember, it is also full of gas, and I just drained it all into a jar so I could look at it to see. Actually, it turned out that the gas looked pretty good because I had put all new filters and new gas in the boat when we first started getting it all set up. It's just that I think the filter was clogged, and eventually it just made the engine bog down. If I had not removed the tank from that whole assembly and put it on the workbench, I would have never been able to get the screws out. But anyway, this is what the tank looks like on the inside. And that little yellow plastic cover comes off, and there's a round rubber thing, and that is the VST filter. Some people clean it, but I just got a new one, and I figured it would just be easier. You can hold it up to the light and you can see it's got a really fine mesh in it, and it's kind of hard to see there, but it was all clogged up with debris over the years. So the new one, you could see right through it. So I think that probably was the problem. And this is the new part here. It was, I think, $60 for the new filter, and I'll just include it in my, I don't know, next 300-hour service or something. Installation is really simple. You just push the little plastic thing onto the filter, and then the filter pushes onto the bottom of the chamber that is inside of the tank. I also took this opportunity to wipe out the tank with some brake cleaner and a rag, and it was clean though. So I think it was just that clogged filter that was giving me the problem. There's also a gasket between the two halves of the tank, and I ordered a new gasket when I got the new filter. And when I took the old gasket out, it was kind of gummed up and melted in there. And I also used a pick and a razor blade and just got it nice and clean because there was a bunch of debris in there. It looked almost like saltwater gel or something like that. But anyway, I got it all clean and put it back together. After really struggling to get the Phillips head screws out, I'm going to go ahead and change them over to the Allen head that I was talking about. This is pretty helpful. It shows all the different hoses that go in the VST. And you got to put them back on. Now I got to put all this stuff back together. I ended up putting new stainless steel screws in top of the VST. The ones that were in there were Phillips head, and they were pretty worn out. And I bought this whole set on Amazon. It was like $8 for 100 screws and a hex wrench. I think it'll be a lot better taking these apart in the future. So. Got the new driveway done too. Finally. Now we can get the boats out. One of the hoses that I had to cut off because it was fused to the VST tank was this one here. It's a molded hose that has an inline fuel filter already built into it, and it goes from the low pressure fuel pump to the top of the VST tank. We have a couple different options when reattaching the hose to the nipple there. One of them is going to be the spring clamp that was on there, and the other is called an Oetiker clamp. They're popular on some European cars and good for tight spaces. Basically, you put it on and then use these special pliers to crimp the ends in, and it makes a real tight seal, and it's good for low clearance areas like this. The real fun begins when you're trying to put everything back together and trying to remember the routing of all the crazy hoses. This is where it's a really good idea to take pictures or label everything or mark it with a paint pen or whatever it takes. It's like putting together a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. Once you've confirmed the correct routing for all the fuel lines and hoses, you can reattach the VST tank with the 3 bolts that hold it onto the intake manifold. Once the tank is reconnected, you can kind of sandwich everything back onto the block, and this is where you can take note of making sure that all your hoses are correct and that they all fit on the fittings that they need to go onto. Next, I loosely fit in all of the bolts to make sure everything is where it's supposed to be. When reattaching the throttle, don't forget about the big flat spring that's behind that black plastic piece, as well as the wave washer. Also, there are a couple of hoses up on top that need to get reconnected as well. And finally, reconnect any electrical connections that you may have disconnected when pulling everything apart.
(144 inch-pounds).
Once everything's been torqued down to specifications, it's time to put the flywheel cover back on. And I do one final last check to make sure all the hoses are connected and snugged down, and all the bolts are tightened and torqued and nothing is missing, and all the filters are tightened up and zip ties are zipped. So, next thing to do is put it out on the water. Thanks for watching.